Second section of this chapter is concerned with clarifying deductive and inductive argument. Second section of this chapter is concerned with the clarification division of chapter into two broadly categorized themes, deductive and inductive reasoning. What is the most widely held misconception about the nature of deductive argument? Misconceptions. What is the most widely held misconception or misunderstanding about the nature of inductive argument and deductive argument? And which reasoning is most common in science? And which reasoning is most common in mathematics? Deductive or inductive? Which reasoning? Which reasoning do you think we depend mainly in our day-to-day thinking? Deductive or inductive, and why? Khalid, Kibrom, and your name? Kafialo. Yes. Which reasoning do you think is most predominant in our day-to-day thinking? Inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning? Most common? Which one is most common? Your name is? Yes, Kalkidan? Yes, Kalkidan, what? Father name? Huh? God, yes. Which reasoning is most common in our day-to-day thinking? Yes? Deductive. Do you agree? Yeah. Deductive is most common. Do you agree? What is your name? Haymanot? Kebron, yes. Which do you think is most common? Deductive. It's what? Inductive. Inductive. Inductive is most common in our day-to-day thinking. Deductives are common in pure mathematical thinking, calculations, and logical thinking. Most of our day-to-day thinking and most of scientific disciplines, thinking in biology, in chemistry, or most natural science depend on inductive thinking. Deductive, mostly deductive, I will come to that point later. Or it's often said that the difference between deduction and induction is that deduction moves from general premise to particular conclusion, whereas induction moves from particular premise to general conclusion. But that, however, is a misconception. It's a misunderstanding, right? The movement does not matter to identify inductive argument from deductive argument, because a deductive argument that moves from particular premise to general premise is possible. For example, every time I eat a peanut, I have an allergic reaction. Every time my friend eats a peanut, they have an allergic reaction. Premise 3, every time my cousin eats peanuts, they have an allergic reaction. Therefore, it can be concluded that people who are allergic to peanuts will have an allergic reaction when they consume peanut. It can be taken as a deductive argument that proceeds from what? Particular premise to general conclusion. But it's taken as a deductive argument. The same thing is true for a deductive argument that proceeds from general premise to a general conclusion. The majority of people who exercise regularly have better physical health. It is what? General statement. The majority of people who eat a balanced diet have better physical health. It's a general statement. Therefore, the majority of people who exercise regularly and eat a balanced diet have better physical health. It's a general. It's a deductive argument that proceeds from general to general. The same thing is true for the third one. From what? Particular to particular. Every time I press the power button on my computer, it turns on. I just press the power button on my computer. Therefore, my computer has turned it on. It's a deductive argument that proceeds from particular to particular. Procedure from particular to particular, from general to general, from particular to general is not essential aspect of deductive and inductive. It's not an essential aspect of inductive and deductive. The same thing is true for an inductive argument. Inductive argument can proceed from general premise to particular conclusion. Studies have shown that regular exercise improves cardiovascular health. John engaged in regular exercise, Mary engaged in regular exercise. Therefore, it's likely that both John and Mary have improved cardiovascular health. It is an inductive argument that proceeds from what? From particular premise to what? General conclusion. But it is an inductive argument. An inductive argument that proceeds from particular premise to particular conclusion. John ate a large portion of spicy food. John experienced heartburn after eating a spicy food. Therefore, it's likely that John's heartburn was caused by spicy food he ate. It is an inductive argument that proceeds from particular to particular. The same thing is true for an inductive argument that proceeds from general to general. Studies have shown that regular exercise improves cardiovascular health. Studies have shown that a balanced diet contributes to overall well-being. Therefore, engaging in regular exercise and maintaining a balanced diet likely promote good overall health. It's an inductive argument that proceeds from what? From general statements to general conclusion. From general premise to general conclusion. So the procedure does not matter. There is a widely, popularly held misconception that an inductive argument proceeds from particular to general and deductive from general to particular, but that's misconception, misunderstanding. That's not the essential aspect of inductive and deductive argument that you need to be aware of. So what is the essential difference? Essential characteristic feature of inductive and deductive argument. If the procedure does not matter, how can we tell whether a particular passage is inductive or deductive? In deductive argument, the conclusion is said to follow necessarily from the premise. The reasoning is mainly, understand that word, mainly move from general principle or premise to specific conclusion. But not always, right? Mainly, it proceeds from general to particular, whereas in inductive argument, it mainly proceeds from particular to general, but it's not always, right? It's not always. The goal is to provide a probable or likely argument. The goal in deductive argument is what? To provide logically valid or conclusive argument. Logically valid or conclusive argument. In other words, the premise guarantees, absolutely guarantees the conclusion. Deductive argument aims to provide certainty, whereas inductive argument aims to what? To provide likelihood, possibility. Deductive argument tend to move from general principle to specific conclusion. They rely on universal principles. Look, the difference between deductive argument proceeds from general principle to particular conclusion, whereas inductive argument proceeds from particular observation to the general principle or to the general assertion, right? But there is no condition in which an inductive argument proceeds from general principle. No inductive argument can proceed from general principle to particular assertion. Principles are only confined to deductive argument. Deductive argument, right? So don't confuse with these two expressions, general principle and general observations. They are entirely two different expressions, right? General principles are for deductive argument. General observations is for inductive argument. The procedure matters. Deductive argument tend to move from general principle to specific conclusions. They rely on universal principle or rules, whereas inductive argument tend to move from specific instances or observation to a general conclusion. The strength of a deductive argument depends on its validity. If the argument is valid, the conclusion must follow logically from the premise. However, the truth of the premise is crucial for the soundness of the argument. The strength of inductive argument is depend on what? Depend on the amount of the premise, reliability, or amount of evidence or observation. If the observation or evidence is big enough, then it can be taken as a strong argument, right? The strength is dependent on the amount of observation or evidence, whereas the strength of deductive argument is based on its validity, based on its structure, based on its form. It is form, right? It is form. Deductive reasoning is commonly used in mathematics, logic, and formal system. It's used to prove theorems, establish logical relationship, and analyze structured argument. Whereas inductive reasoning is commonly used in where? In our everyday reasoning. in scientific inquiries, research, everyday reasoning. It is used to make prediction, form hypothesis, and draw conclusion based on observed pattern or evidence, right? Inductive reasoning is what we mostly, commonly encounter in our everyday reasoning, but it suffers from certain epistemological predicament. A philosopher by the name Bertrand Russell come up with the problem known as the problem of induction. Problem of induction. You can search it in the search in your Google search, problem of induction. Even though we depend on our inductive reasoning in our everyday reasoning, but it suffers from certain epistemological predicaments, certain crises that cannot be answered, cannot be certain of its occurrence. Right? There are three tests that greatly simplify the task of determining whether an argument should be regarded as deductive or inductive. The first test is using indicator word. Indicator words, we have said, cannot be an absolute guarantee, but they provide us clues or source of information to easily identify inductive or deductive argument. Strict necessity is much more stronger than indicator word technique. A strict necessity test is a kind of mental inspection. It's a mental introspection of the linkage, the strength and weakness between the premise and the conclusion. Common pattern tests, they are commonly inductive argument, commonly deductive argument that simplifies the task of telling whether an argument is deductive and inductive argument. Indicator words such as certainly, it logically follows that, definitely, it logically, to conclude that, absolutely, this logically implies that, conclusively, this entails that, are deductive indicators, whereas inductive indicators, probably one would expect that likely it's good bet that it's plausible, it's reasonable to assume that outside this are all inductive indicators, right? But they're not absolute guarantee. They only provide us clues or source of information. Strict necessity is more stronger as compared to the indicator word technique. Strict necessity tests can be stated as follows. An argument's conclusion either follows with a strict logical necessity from its premise. If the argument's conclusion does follow with strict logical necessity from its premise, the argument should be treated as deductive. If the argument conclusion does not follow with strict logical necessity, it is treated as an inductive argument. Look at the example. Alan is a father, therefore Alan is a male. Jill is 6 years old girl, therefore Jill cannot run a mile in 1 minute. Which one is inductive and which one is deductive and why? Alan is a father, therefore Alan is a male. It's a deductive way. New hand. Your name is Kamal, yes, your name? Kalab what? Wooden, yes. Alan is a father, therefore Alan is a male. It's a deductive. Why? Because the existence of therefore? No. It's a deductive reasoning because we cannot question the possibility, the occurrence of the conclusion if we assume the premise to be true. The truth of the conclusion is absolutely linked with the premise. We cannot conceive of any condition that will falsify the conclusion. Alan is a father, therefore Alan is a male. It's a deductive argument because we cannot think of any possibility, 0.001 possibility that will falsify the conclusion. We cannot conceive of, we cannot think of any condition at all that will falsify the conclusion. If the premise is true, then the conclusion must be true. It's a deductive argument. The conclusion is absolutely linked with the premise. But look at the second one. Jill is 6 years old girl, therefore Jill cannot run a mile in 1 minute flat. It's an inductive argument. Why? Because we can think of a 0.001 possibility that will falsify the conclusion. What will be that possible condition that will falsify the conclusion? Because it is possible to imagine a situation where Jill as an exceptional individual that could run a mile in 1 minute flat, despite being a 6-year-old girl. It's at least possible to imagine a situation that will falsify the conclusion. But we cannot imagine the condition that will falsify the conclusion in the first example. If the premise is true, then the conclusion must be true, right? possibility. There is at least a 0.001 possibility that will falsify the conclusion, right? Strict necessity test, it's a kind of mental inspection of the strengths or relation between the premise and the conclusion. Common pattern test, most widely popularly used technique. The most widely popularly used technique to identify inductive argument from deductive argument is common pattern test. There are certain passages which are commonly associated as inductive. There are certain passages which are commonly associated as deductive argument. Argument based on prediction, argument based on analogy, generalization, from authority based on sign, causal inference are commonly inductive argument. Commonly inductive argument. Argument based on definition, based on mathematics, and based on syllogism are commonly deductive argument. They're common pattern test is the most commonly used technique that we shall use to identify inductive and deductive argument. What is the common feature of deductive argument? The premise is exactly the same to the conclusion. Hypothetical syllogism, categorical syllogism, argument by elimination, disjunctive syllogism, argument based on mathematics, and argument from definition, characterized by the common feature in which the content of the premise is exactly the same as the conclusion. But in inductive argument, the content of the premise is less than the conclusion. The conclusion contains more than the premise. Syllogism, what's syllogism? Have you ever heard about this word before? Syllogism is typically deductive pattern. What the word syllogism itself is? It's a word, a concept. November የለም ና okay. What is syllogism? What is the word syllogism? Define the word syllogism. Who coined the word syllogism? Aristotle, right? Syllogism refers to what? An argument that consists of how many premises and how many conclusions? Two premises and one conclusion. Yes. Exactly two premises and one conclusion. Syllogism is an argument that consists of exactly. The word exactly is very important. No more, no less. Exactly two premises and one conclusion, right? What's a hypothetical syllogism? A hypothetical syllogism is a syllogism that contains conditional statement in either the premise or the conclusion. Hypothetical statement, hypothetical syllogism, conditional statement or hypothetical statement in either the premise or the conclusion. If P then Q, it is P therefore Q, it's hypothetical syllogism. Premise one is hypothetical conditional, its nature, right? It's a syllogistic argument. It is a deductive argument, hypothetical syllogism. Categorical syllogism are deductive argument. What's categorical syllogism? As the word implies, they categorize some element of the subject included into the predicate class, or some elements are excluded. The predicate class or all element of the subject is included or excluded from the predicate class, or no element of the subject is excluded or included in relation to the predicate class, right? Categorical syllogisms are three lines of argument in which each statement begins with what? All, some, and no. They begin with all, some, or no. They are always treated as deductive argument. Hypothetical, categorical, and disjunctive. Disjunctive syllogism is also known as argument by elimination, but they are not exactly the same. Argument by elimination and disjunctive syllogism, we can use them interchangeably, but they are not exactly the same. Who can tell me the difference between these two terms? Disjunctive syllogism and argument by elimination. Disjunctive syllogism is typically syllogistic argument, but argument by elimination, it may or may not be treated as a disjunctive syllogism. The premise may be two or more. Premises can be two or more. Or the possibilities to be eliminated can be two or more. But in disjunctive syllogism, we have two options. One option is eliminated, and the remaining option is going to be the conclusion of the argument in disjunctive syllogism, right? But in argument by elimination, we can have three options. like this example. The thief who stole the jewelry must be either Anna, Ben, or Carla. Anna has a right alibi or evidence and was out of town during the time of the theft. Ben was caught on TV footage at different locations during the time of theft. Therefore, theft who stole the jewelry must be Carla. It's a kind of argument by eliminations. It provides with different alternatives, and you tend to get rid of an alternative, and the remaining alternative is going to be the conclusion of the argument, right? Argument by elimination or disjunctive syllogisms are always treated as deductive argument. We cannot question the possibility of the conclusion if we assume the premise to be true, right? Argument based on mathematics are always deductive argument. Light travels at the rate of 186,000 miles per second. The sun is more than 93 million miles distant from the Earth. Therefore, it takes more than 8 minutes for the sun's light to reach the Earth. It's pure algebraic calculations. Pure algebraic calculations are always deductive argument. We cannot question the possibility of the occurrence or the truth of the conclusion if the premises are assumed to be true. Algebraic calculations, geometric computations, and arithmetic calculations are always deductive argument. But don't confuse argument based on mathematics with argument based on statistics. Who can tell me the difference? Argument based on mathematics and argument based on statistics. The similarity is both of them can contain numbers. But unlike mathematics, statistical argument contain what? Sample and percentage, yes, data or observation. Sample and percentage, right? Argument based on statistics are always inductive argument, whereas argument based on mathematics are always deductive argument. Algebraic, pure mathematical calculation, algebraic or pure geometrical calculation or arithmetic calculation are always treated as deductive argument. Argument from definition are always deductive argument. Janelle is a cardiologist, therefore Janelle is a doctor. Berta is an aunt, therefore she is a woman. It's argument based on definition of certain concept. The truth of the conclusion is exactly equal to the truth of the premise. The conclusion does not produce new information, but it's just simply re-expressing the truth content of the premise in another phraseology, right? So deductive argument, premise and conclusion are exactly equal. The conclusion does not add up on any information, but just simply repeating the same informations in another way of saying it, in another way of expressing it. But inductive argument, the common feature is the premise is less than the conclusion. The conclusion is greater than the premise. The truth, the information content of the conclusion tell us something more than what is implied by the premise, right? Inductive generalization is typically inductive argument. The name itself tells us something about its essence. All dinosaur bones so far discovered has been more than 65 million years old. Therefore, probably all dinosaur bones are more than 65 million years old. It is an inductive generalization, taking some sample, investigating the samples, and making a general assertion about the general population based on the investigation or observation from the sample, based on investigation or observation from the sample. But for an inductive generalization to be accepted as good argument, certain conditions must be met. The sample must be selected randomly, and the sample must be big enough. The sample must be big enough to represent the whole population. The fallacy that arises if this condition is missed is known as hasty generalization. What hasty means? The sample is not representative enough. The sample is not big enough to represent the whole population, right? Inductive generalization can be taken as good argument if and only if the sample is representative and the sample is big enough, strong enough to represent the whole population, right? The strength of the argument is depend on the representativeness and the dependability or reliability of the available sample. The sample must be strong enough or big enough to be taken as good inductive argument, right? To be taken as good inductive argument. The fallacy associated with inductive generalization has the generalization that will come to later on when we deal with informal fallacy, right? Predictive argument is not deductive argument. It is an inductive argument because the information content of the conclusion is greater than the premise. Predictive argument, as the name implies, it tells us something about what will happen in the future based on the available information from the past or from the present, right? Because nothing in the future is absolutely certain. Argument containing predictions are usually, not always, usually inductive argument. Why we say usually? Because sometimes predictive argument can be argued deductively. Predictive argument can be argued deductively. An argument which tells us about what will happen in the future may sometimes, rarely, can be considered as deductive argument. All mammals give birth to live young. Platypus is a mammal, therefore platypus will give birth to live young. It's about what will happen in the future, but it is a deductive argument. It's a deductive argument. The argument is deductive because it follows a logical structure. It's a categorical in its type, right? This argument is categorical syllogism, but it is telling about what will happen in the future. Even though it's predictive, it is deductive in its essence. It follows a logical structure where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premise. The premise establishes general rule that all mammals give birth to live young. It also provides specific instance that platypus is a mammal. Based on the defined category and the general rule, the conclusion logically follows that the platypus will give birth to live young, right? So it's a very rare circumstance, very rare occasions in which predictive passages can be argued deductively, right? But mainly, predictive arguments are always mainly inductive argument in their natures, right? Argument from analogy, it's an inductive argument. The structure of argument based on analogy is P and Q are similar with respect to property A, B, and C. P has been observed to have further property X, therefore Q probably has property X, right? Strength of argument based on authorities depend on the relevance of the known similarity, the degree of relevant similarity between the two objects, and the amount and variety of instances that forms the basis of the analogy. Let's look at the example. Argument based on analogy is always inductive argument. Human and chimpanzees share high degree of genetic similarity and have similar anatomical structure. Premise 2, humans have the ability to use language for communication. Therefore, it's probable that chimpanzees also have the ability to use language for communication. It's argument based on analogy. Its strength is depend on what? Based on the relevance of the similarity. Yes, based on the relevance of the similarity. When an argument from analogy can provide insight and generate hypothesis, it does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. It relies on perceived similarity and inference rather than deductive certainty, right? Some writers or some speakers tend to use certain superficial similarity for their own personal agenda. For their own personal agenda, writers may tend to use superficial or irrelevant similarity. So the first question that you need to ask yourself is whether the similarity mentioned is relevant enough. Similarity mentioned is what? Anatomical structure and what? Genetic similarity. Is this similarity relevant enough to support the conclusion? If the answer is yes, then the argument can be taken as good argument based on analogy. It can be taken as good argument based on analogy. But if we think of some other similarity that outweighs the similarity mentioned in the argument, the fallacy committed is known as weak analogy. Weak analogy. We'll come to that point later on when we treat with informal fallacy. Right? Weak analogy is when mentioned similarity is somehow superficial or irrelevant to support the conclusion. We can think of some other factors that outweigh the mentioned similarity, such as cognitive abilities, is more important, which has been neglected by the author or the writer of this particular assertion. Then we can consider the entire argument as weak analogy, right? Weak analogy, right? So when treating argument based on analogy, we need to take into consideration the relevance of the known similarity, the degree of relevant similarity, the amount and varieties of instance that form the basis of the analogy, right? The analogy in itself cannot be taken as at the basis of a good argument based on analogy. Good argument based on analogy, similarity must be strong enough or big enough to support the conclusion. Causal argument. cause-effect relationship, as the name implies. The argument is based on cause-effect relationship, based on specific instance or observation. Every time I eat ice cream, I get headache. Therefore, eating ice cream causes me to get a headache is the causal argument. The argument is based on cause-effect relationship. Just like argument based on prediction, causal argument sometimes may be argued deductively. Causal argument may sometimes may be argued deductively, right? But mostly causal arguments are inductive argument. Look at the example in order to illustrate this point. Whenever iron exposed to oxygen, it rusts. This iron pipe has been exposed to oxygen. Therefore, it will rust. It's a causal argument, right? Cause-effect relationship. But it is a deductive argument. It's a deductive argument, even though it's a cause-effect relationship between the premise and the conclusion. But it's a deductive argument. Why? Because the premise established a general principle that whenever iron is exposed to oxygen, it rusts, right? We cannot question or possibly ask the possibility of the occurrence of the conclusion. The conclusion is absolutely linked or entirely related to the premise without any possibility to be turned out to be false, right? To be turned out to be false, right? Such kind of examples are very rare. Causal arguments may argue deductively, but their occurrence is very rare as compared. Mostly causal arguments are inductive argument. They are inductive argument. Statistical arguments are very much similar to argument based on mathematics. We have already said because they contain in number. But unlike mathematical arguments, statistical arguments contain what? Data, percentage, and sample. Yes, data, percentage, and samples. Even though they contain numbers, but they're not deductive arguments, right? Pure mathematical argument is based on algebraic computation, geometric computation, and arithmetic calculations. Statistical arguments are inductive. Argument from authority are inductive arguments. The structure of argument based on authority: person A claims that X is true. Person A is an expert in the field concerning X. Therefore, X should be believed. Example for argument based on authority: Dr. Smith, renowned scientist, claimed that climate change is primarily caused by human activity. Dr. Smith is an expert in the field of climate science with multiple peer-reviewed publications. Therefore, we should believe that climate change is primarily caused by human activities. It can be taken as good inductive argument if certain preconditions are met. The preconditions are what? The authority mentioned should be relevant enough. He or she must be an expert in the subject mentioned in that particular argument, right? But we tend to use some irrelevant authority to support our argument. Irrelevant authority, even though the authority is famous in his field, he cannot support our argument if the subject in our argument is not related to his field, his or her field, right? Dr. Smith is a scientist, and the subject in question is about science. Therefore, the argument can be taken as good inductive argument. Good inductive argument. The fallacy, when this condition is not missed, is known as unqualified authority. Unqualified authority will come to that point later on. Not because of lack of expertise, but because of lack of credibility. Credibility or authenticity. Authenticity in one's intention or motivation itself may be the reason for committing the fallacy of unqualified authority. The expertise is correct, but the intention may be incorrect. Intention or motivation may be incorrect. So we need to make a secondary investigation before deciding whether that particular argument based on authority is relevant or not. We will come to that point later on, more specifically when we look into the fallacy of unqualified authority in the coming chapter.